All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Tel Kreutzwages, and I'm going to talk to you about how we deal with hyper-realistic AI-generated faces. And this is a project that kind of led from this work that we saw in around 2018, where we saw these really developments in deep neural networks, generative adversarial networks that generated faces, mostly that looked really real. And basically I thought like, oh, it would be really good to see neural responses to these faces, behavioral responses, because these computer scientists who generated these images, they thought like, oh, these look really real, and left it at that. So there was no behavioral comparison. Since 2018, there have been quite a few studies looking at this, but this is where it came out of. So we have these faces that are, so these are all people that do not exist. These are faces generated by computers. They look really real. Anything that you can find a lot of on the internet, you can generate. So you can do cars, bedrooms, cats, and they all look very realistic. Now, why should we look into the into behavioral responses and human behavior in relation to these faces? Is because they potentially have some good applications, maybe some bad applications. We need to figure out how they influence our behavior, and especially on the internet, social media, we can use deep fakes, we can use these synthetic images to post misinformation, for example. So we need to establish how humans deal with these stimuli. And we did this in one study. I'm not going to talk about this study today because it was accepted 2 days ago, yay. And so you can read all about it very soon. But what we basically did, we took 25 of these faces and presented them to humans. We showed that they have a really hard time distinguishing real from fake. But when we recorded EEG, we could classify pretty well whether people were looking at an image of a real person or a synthetic person. And that went away when we turned the image upside down. Super interesting, because it means it's not something low-level visual, but it's something about the face. There. And there was this study that came out this year that showed that people judge these synthesized faces as more trustworthy than images of real people. This was very fun because we were already running this project that I'm talking to you about today. So cards on the table, this is a really nice scoop of the results that I'm presenting today. But what we have, what they don't have, is neural data. So here we want to look at the intersection between these synthesized faces, trustworthy judgments, and EEG. So we look at the intersection of these three, represented by us in the middle as a penguin here. And what we did was collected a large stimulus set. So our previous study, we only had 25 stimuli. I wanted to go bigger. So here we have 800 stimuli of real faces, fake faces. We try to match them on gender, on skin color, and so on, and then match them on gaze direction, for example, whether they're all looking straight or not. So we have a lot of stimuli. Half of these are fake. I can't tell you which half. I'm terrible at faces, but you probably also can't when they're this small. We use an implicit trust judgment task. So we presented a face for 100 milliseconds and we told our participants, you have to decide whether this face, the person is trustworthy, because they're going to make a recommendation and you have to press either the button that they recommended, or if you don't trust them, press the other button. So they decided whether they would follow their recommendation and then responded accordingly. And then we gave them feedback in the form of telling them whether they pressed the correct button or not. So not whether they made the correct trust judgment, but whether they were correct in the button they chose. And we actually randomized this completely. So we made them on average 70% correct. So it actually didn't matter which button. We always just said a good job 70% of the time. So they felt like they were doing a good job, hopefully. And meanwhile, we recorded EEG. And we also ran a separate independent online study with more participants, but fewer trials. So we have an online study where we had 160 of these trials, and an EEG study where we present the full 800 stimuli. Now, when we look at their trustworthiness judgments, we look at the difference between their trustworthiness, so whether they followed or didn't follow the instruction, more or less for the real faces versus the fake faces. So what I'm showing you here is the difference in how often they followed the instruction by a real face versus a fake face. So if that difference is at 0, there's no difference. If it's to the right, they trust the fakes more. If it's to the left, they trust the fakes less. And what we found indeed was that they trust the fakes more. And around this time, this other paper came out showing exactly this. So that was fantastic. So this is the online data. If we look at the EEG data, we found the same effect in that they trusted the fakes more. Notably, we only found it when we looked at the first 160 trials. So this is the same amount of data as we use for the online, and that effect tended to go away towards the end of the experiment. I don't have time to get into this today, but that will be something interesting to talk about in the paper. And then we looked at the EEG results and we used representational similarity analysis. So different from the previous talk where they were looking at component analysis, here we look at all the channels in the EEG at the same time in response to one phase versus another phase. We look at how similar is the overall brain response at one specific time point between these two phases. And we store the similarity between all channel activations in a matrix. So for all our stimuli, we have 800 stimuli. So we make an 800 by 800 matrix of similarities between evoked activity between two phases. And that creates a matrix with some variance. Some phases are more similar, evoke more similar signals than others. And we create one of these for all the time points in the evoked response and for all our subjects. So we have 28 subjects in EEG. So for all the subjects, we have a time varying similarity matrix. And they look like this. So here I semi-randomly pick 4 interesting points to show you this matrix. So here we have 800 by 800 stimuli. The color of each pixel represents the similarity of the faces. And we see some interesting squares going on. What we can do is we can map this into a two-dimensional space. So here I'm plotting these similarities. So points in these spaces below, if they are closer together, they evoke more similar brain activity. If they are further apart, they evoke dissimilar brain activity. And I coded them according to whether the stimulus was real or fake. So I don't know which way around, but it doesn't matter because you don't actually see a difference here. You see some interesting structures. It looks to be like a Necker cube kind of structure. So, so we can visualize these data, but what we actually want to do is model it. So we want to know what information is represented in these matrices. And we can do this with representational similarity. So we start from these time varying dissimilarity matrices. So one of these matrices for each time point. And what we can do is create candidate models of what we think this matrix would look like if it was representing, for example, veracity, so real or fake, fakeness of the stimuli. And then when you compare this candidate model to the time varying dissimilarity matrices, you see how well it matches, how well it explains variance in these matrices, and you get a time varying correlation for each of your subjects. And you can then analyze these at the group level. So you can look at whether the mean correlation is above 0 for your group sample. So we did this. We have here 4 models that each make different predictions about what the similarity structure would look like. So the first one is very straightforward. Was it an image of a real face or a fake face? This model says that fake faces would be more similar to other fake faces. Real faces would be more similar to other real faces, and they would be different from each other. We also have visual models, so image similarity, where we just look in pixel space how dissimilar are 2 images, and we see how much that explains in the data. Image typicality is the distance from one face to the average of all faces, and we can see whether typicality influences the EEG data as well. And then we have our trust model, whether people trusted the faces or not. And the nice thing with the trust model is you can do this on individual participants. So you can see if their judgments are related to their brain activity, but then that still analyzes at the group level. And at the bottom, I'm showing you how similar these models are to each other. So the models are not very correlated, so they explain, they make different predictions. So correlate these 4 models to our EEG dissimilarity matrices, and then we get correlations over time for our 4 different models. So here time is on the x-axis, We have 0 where we presented the stimulus up to 1.2 seconds. That's after they made their decision to press the left or the right button. And what we saw is that we get a very strong variance explained by our veracity model, so real versus fake images. So we can again predict very well from the EEG whether people were looking at real versus fake images. So they evoke different, very systematically different brain activity in all our subjects. Below the plots, I have the points there showing you at what time points these models were significant. We see some information explained by image similarity, also some image typicality and some trust. We did see that image typicality and trust were kind of co-activating quite a bit. So this kind of suggests that maybe trust is here related to typicality as well. And this is something we know that you're more likely to trust a face that is more typical and less likely to trust atypical faces. And this is also what these deep networks do. They tend to generate things that are closer to the average face, so less unique faces. Right, so now we have our EEG data, our behavioral data, and from this, we concluded that indeed people do trust the deepfakes more. Trust and veracity seem to explain significant variance in the EEG, but we think that it may be caused by low-level similarity and typicality that underlie these trust judgments. Now, this is still interesting, I think, in a real-world context, because if people trust deepfakes more, like I said, this may have significant effects on like how we deal with social media, for example. If I post some misinformation on Twitter, nobody really cares, but maybe if we use a more trustworthy face generated by a deepfake, people do care, and people might retweet this way more. And as I said, one of these studies was published or accepted a few days ago. The other one, if this one is something to go about, it took 2 years, so the other one might take another 2 years to get out, but I encourage you to check it out. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators. I want to say this came out of an honors project that was run here at Western Sydney by all these people here on the team. And thank you for your attention.